This is part 2 of my lecture on the U.S. after the American Revolution. So we left off talking about the Constitutional Convention. Prior to the Constitutional Convention, since 1781, the Articles of Confederation, as essentially the first American Constitution, helped to govern the new country. It created the United States in Congress, which it was a Congress that could make war, peace, and foreign policy, and it could create an army, a navy, and a state bureaucracy. It also controlled the western lands ceded by the British, but it couldn't do most things we now associate with the federal government, things like taxation. It had no court system, there was no executive. So many of the people gathered at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, including Alexander Hamilton, wanted a stronger central government with more powers. Hamilton wanted a stronger and more elitist government that would guarantee opportunity for men like himself and security for people who had, quote, anything to lose. James Madison's greatest contribution was to set the agenda at the Constitution. Like Hamilton, he also wanted a stronger central government to balance out the power of the states. So, what came out of the convention? After 4 months of negotiations, the 57 men who gathered decided on the present American government, a system of dual federalism in which the federal and state governments would share power. They did away with a single chamber Congress, which Vermont had. That was the example I gave you. They replaced it with a Congress made up of two houses. So the upper house was the Senate. All states had equal representation in the Senate, and the senators were not elected by the people initially. They were chosen by state legislatures for 6-year terms. The lower house was the House of Representatives. The representation in this house, this body, was proportional based on the population, and the members were elected for 2-year terms by the people, directly by the people. So it's the more democratic of the two. The Constitution also established a presidency/executive and a judiciary. It was not entirely democratic. The president was actually to be chosen through the Electoral College, not through direct election. Similarly, judges weren't elected by the people. So these two things are still very much in existence today. We know in the last election, for instance, that the president received a majority of the popular vote, but did not, or I should say, the Hillary Clinton one received a majority of the popular vote, but Donald Trump won because of the Electoral College. So what is the Electoral College? We're going to go over this in class a little bit more, but the Electoral College consists of electors, people called electors. There are 538 electors. And where does this number come from? It represents the number of people in the House of Representatives, plus 100 senators, plus 3 representatives for Washington, D.C. specifically. And in this system, of course, smaller states get more bang for their buck because of the Senate, because there's equal representation in the Senate, meaning that now in the Electoral College, the smaller states actually the less populous states have more electors, right, than they would if it was, based on proportional representation entirely. So why did the founders set up an Electoral College? Well, first of all, they had real doubts that a popular vote was the wisest way to choose a president. They were afraid of ordinary people, essentially. They worried that ordinary people weren't smart enough. But the Electoral College also was set up, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but it was also set up specifically to protect the interests of the South and the system, including the system of slavery. We don't, as voters, elect the president. The electors are the ones that ultimately elect the president. And all electors in any one state, for the most part, go to the winning candidate. It's mostly a winner-take-all situation. So the electors are usually not split for each state. And the electors are chosen by the party. Okay, so let's talk about I might play a couple of videos in class, but let's skip these for now. So one of the greatest weaknesses of the Constitution is that it protected the institution of slavery. There were provisions explicitly sanctioning slavery in a few different places. Number one, there's the Three-Fifths Compromise. Talk about more in a second. Number two, Congress was prevented from banning the slave trade, the international slave trade, until 1808. Number three, there was a fugitive slave clause that prohibited states from emancipating fugitive slaves and required that runaways be returned to their slave owners. It also said that Congress would use its military power to suppress slave rebellions in the states. But most prominent, I think, among these is the Three-Fifths Compromise. This involves slaves being counted for the purposes of representation in order to increase the South's influence in Congress. So enslaved people would be counted for the purposes of representation to give more representatives to white people, essentially. They would free white people, right? But they would not have, enslaved people, of course, did not have the right to vote. So this increases the representation for the white South in the federal government. Essentially, the Three-Fifths Compromise said that three-fifths of the enslaved population are counted for purposes of representation in Congress and the Electoral College, as well as for the purposes of taxation. By doing so, it increased the power of slave owners by giving them greater representation in Congress. It also increased the incentive to import more slaves over the next 20 years before the international slave trade was abolished, because the more slaves that are imported to the South, the higher, the more power the white South has in the federal government. Meanwhile, in the North, Northerners, people in the North, did succeed in banning slavery in the Western territories with the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. Though there was strong opposition by people known as the Anti-Federalists to the Constitution, support ultimately was more widespread, and the Constitution was ratified in June of 1788, the summer after the Constitutional Convention first convened. Many states only ratified the Constitution with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would quickly be added. This is a great video. I'm not going to play it here. I'm having some issues with my computer, but I'll play it in class. It's more information about the Electoral College and what the history of slavery, the institution of slavery, has to do with it. Okay, the Bill of Rights are what most of us think of when we think of the Constitution, but the Bill of Rights wasn't actually ratified by the states until a few years later in 1791. So let's go quickly over some of these. The First Amendment is probably one of the most well-known amendments. It guarantees freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly. You have the Second Amendment, which is the right to keep and bear arms. We'll take a closer look at this in a second. And then the Third Amendment, no soldier can be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. So something that the British were doing in people's houses, and so this made it into the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment guarantees a no unreasonable search and seizure. A warrant is required for the government to come and search our houses. The Fifth Amendment, the right not to self-incriminate, which comes in handy especially during the McCarthy era in the 1940s and 50s. There's the Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy and public trial with an impartial jury. Okay, I'll go through these a little bit more quickly. Right, so 10th Amendment, powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for states or the people. That's a pretty important one. But I want to talk a little bit more about the Second Amendment, since it's such a big matter of debate in our country. It comes up again and again after each incident of mass gun violence in the U.S. So it reads, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So this is the amendment that's supposed to protect gun rights. The question is, why was the Second Amendment included in the Bill of Rights? I'm going to explain this history by citing this one book in particular. It's called Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. You can judge for yourself of how convincing this argument is. I encourage you to do your own research, but I think it's an interesting argument. So while some argue that the intention of the Second Amendment was specifically to provide for state militias, i.e., the National Guard today, Dunbar Ortiz is convinced that the intentions of the Second Amendment were to protect an individual's right to bear arms. She says that other parts of the Constitution talk about the rights of states to keep state militias, that the Bill of Rights is about enumerating the rights of individuals, not states. So why would it be necessary, though, in the Constitution to to stipulate that individuals have the right to bear arms? So Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and other historians have argued that one key goal after independence was that settlers wanted to claim land in the West, which I've mentioned. They wanted access to land, right, that was occupied by Native Americans. And to gain access to this land, they had to be armed. They had to have the ability to violently take land from Native Americans and also be prepared to violently defend their right to that land. Dunbar Ortiz cites one early historian to help prove her point. Quote, "The early settlers on the frontiers of this country were like Arabs of the desert of Africa, in at least two respects. Every man was a soldier, and from early in the spring till late in the fall, was almost continually in arms. Their work was often carried on by parties, each one of whom had his rifle." In other words, expansion to the West wouldn't just depend on the military to pave the way west, but on individually armed men. Dunbar Ortiz writes, quote, "Taking land by force was not an accidental or spontaneous project or the work of a few rogue characters. The violent appropriation of native land by white settlers, the decades following the American Revolution, the violent appropriation of native land by white settlers was seen as an individual right in the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, second only to freedom of speech. Thomas Jefferson argued for westward expansion in his call for the U.S. to establish, quote, an empire of liberty. Jefferson said, quote, "However our present interests may restrain us within our own limits, it is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed by similar laws." Dunbar Ortiz moves beyond her focus on the use of guns to take land from Native Americans. She also says that armed individual white men were used to form slave patrols to capture runaway slaves. In fact, participation in slave patrols was often mandatory for less well-off men. So, in essence, her argument is about the fact that people in the South, in this country, in the newly formed United States, needed to have access to owning a weapon so that they could help with the project of westward expansion and the kind of dispossession of Native Americans of their land that required, as well as it required to protect the institution of slavery. That's what she says the origins of the Second Amendment were. So in conclusion, I want to say a few things. So first, this was the first revolution in the Western Hemisphere. The United States was actually the first independent country in the Americas. I think that, though it was an incomplete revolution, I do think that politically speaking, it made some important changes. It expanded the right to vote, which is nothing to scoff at, even if the right to vote was still very limited. It severed our ties with England, which, yes, was definitely imposing its will on all colonists in a very undemocratic and authoritarian manner. But of course, the American Revolution still had severe limitations. And I think that talking about the revolution without acknowledging and emphasizing these limitations is actually an injustice to the very ideals that the revolution was supposed to be promoting: equality and liberty. Equality and liberty must be for everybody for these ideals to really have meaning. That said, I think the American Revolution started something important. Many people, from marginalized communities, people of color, women, would claim the ideals presented in the Declaration of Independence as their own. In other words, the American Revolution raised people's expectations about what was possible. Okay, that's it.